My parents just confessed that they secretly used my house as collateral to bail my brother out of his latest financial ruin. And now I have exactly 30 days to find $100,000, or we'll all be out on the street. It all started about 3 weeks ago when I began to notice that my mother, Linda, was acting unusually nervous every time I mentioned my plans for expanding my independent business. I've been working as a freelance graphic designer for the past 7 years, and I've spent every single day of that time fighting for a normal life, saving every penny and skipping vacations just so I could finally buy this small cottage in the suburbs of Austin. My father, Robert, always told me how proud he was of my independence, while my younger brother, Stephen, constantly bounced from one brilliant idea to another, failing every single time and returning to our parents' house with empty pockets. Stephen was always the favorite, the difficult child, who always needed a little more attention, a little more understanding, and as it turned out later, significantly more money than our family ever actually had. That evening, I went to my parents' house for a regular Sunday dinner, bringing a bottle of wine and hoping to discuss the upcoming renovations for my living room. The atmosphere in the house was strange. The air felt heavy with unspoken words, and Stephen was sitting in the corner of the sofa, buried in his phone and avoiding any kind of eye contact with me. When we sat down at the table, my father spent a long time picking at his turkey with a fork, and my mother kept adjusting the napkins even though they were already perfectly straight. Finally, Linda took a deep breath, looked at me with that exact expression she used to wear when she wanted me to do Stephen's homework back in high school, and said they had something important to tell me. She started from a distance, talking about how hard things were for Stephen right now, how his latest crypto flipping project had suddenly collapsed due to some kind of fraud, and how debt collectors had started physically threatening him. I listened to this with my usual sense of irritation, fully expecting them to ask me for a couple of $1,000s as a loan, but the reality was far more terrifying. It turns out that Stephen managed to drag our parents into some shady private loan scheme, and when the situation became critical, they didn't find anything better to do than to use the general power of attorney I had signed for them 3 years ago when I was leaving for a long-term contract in Europe. They mortgaged my house, which was technically under a joint title with my father due to the specific financing requirements when I first bought it, and now the people they took the money from are demanding a full refund of the entire amount plus insane interest rates. When Linda said the words, "We had to use your property to save your brother's life," I felt a ringing in my ears, and the room slowly began to spin. I looked at Stephen, expecting to see at least a shadow of remorse on his face, but he just snapped at me, claiming that I had always been successful, and that it was easy for me to judge from my high horse. My father remained silent, staring at the floor, and only then did I realize the true scale of the catastrophe. They hadn't just borrowed money, they had jeopardized my entire future for a man who hasn't worked a single honest day in his life. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I only remember fragments of phrases about family bonds, supporting each other in hard times, and promises that Stephen would definitely work it all off. But the worst part came at the end, when my father handed me a letter from a law firm stating in plain English that if the amount wasn't paid in 30 days, the foreclosure process would begin. I walked out of their house feeling like I had been gutted, and I sat in my car just staring into the darkness in front of me. My own parents, the people I trusted more than anyone in the world, had deceived me in the most cynical way possible, hiding behind their love for my deadbeat brother. At that moment, I didn't yet know that this was only the beginning, and that the next 4 weeks would turn into a literal hell where I would have to choose between my own financial survival and the remaining scraps of human feeling I had for my family. I knew I didn't have that kind of money sitting in a bank account. All my funds were tied up in long-term projects or equipment, and no bank would ever approve a new loan for me with such a massive lien already placed on my home. When I got back to my place, I walked through the rooms that no longer belonged to me, touching the walls I had painted myself, and I felt a cold, calculating rage beginning to boil inside. Stephen always got away with everything, he was always bailed out, and his mistakes were always paid for by someone else, but this time the price was too high. I pulled out my laptop and started studying the documents I had managed to photograph on my parents' table, trying to find any loophole, any legal gap that would allow me to void that cursed power of attorney retroactively. But the more I read, the clearer it became that they had thought of everything, or rather, the people who gave them the money were professionals at this. It was a trap that had snapped shut with a deafening click, and the countdown had already started. I didn't sleep at all that night, replaying the faces of my mother and father in my head. Faces that didn't show an apology, but rather a strange demand, as if I were truly obligated to sacrifice myself for Stephen. I spent the entire next day on calls with lawyers, but every one of them shook their head after learning the details of the voluntarily signed power of attorney and my father's name on the deed. The only way out was to find the money and find it fast, but in my world, amounts like that don't just fall from the sky. I realized that I had 30 days of struggle ahead of me, not just for the walls and the roof over my head, but for my own right not to be destroyed by the very people who were supposed to protect me. By the 5th day, the initial shock had hardened into a heavy, constant pressure in the center of my chest that made it difficult to take a full breath. I spent most of my mornings at my desk, staring at my dual-monitor setup, trying to focus on client work, but my eyes kept drifting to the folder on the corner of the table containing the loan documents. Every hour that passed felt like a physical weight being added to my shoulders. I had contacted 3 different real estate attorneys, and the consensus was grim, because the power of attorney was broad and legally notarized, and because my father's name was indeed on the primary deed for tax purposes we had agreed on years ago. The lien was perfectly legal. My parents hadn't just made a mistake. They had executed a calculated maneuver that required several steps of planning. They had to visit a notary, they had to provide my house's title, and they had to sign papers that explicitly stated my home was the guarantee for Stephen's bad choices. I decided to drive over to my parents' house again on Tuesday evening because I needed to see the original contract Stephen had signed with these private lenders. I wanted to know where the money went. When I pulled into their driveway, I saw Stephen's car, a BMW that he definitely couldn't afford, parked right in the middle, blocking the garage. It made my blood boil. I walked in without knocking and found them in the kitchen, eating dinner as if nothing was wrong. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, a scent that used to mean comfort, but now just felt like an insult. Stephen was laughing at something on his phone, and my mother was smiling at him. That smile died the moment she saw me standing in the doorway. I didn't sit down. I told them I needed the full paperwork for the Apex Holdings loan, which was the name of the group that now owned a piece of my life. My father, Robert, tried to play the role of the peacemaker, telling me to calm down and have some dinner, saying that getting angry wouldn't solve the math. I told him the math was already solved. I was short $100,000 and 30 days away from being homeless. Stephen finally looked up, shoved a piece of bread into his mouth, and said I was being dramatic. He told me that he was working on a massive deal that would close in 2 weeks and he'd pay off the whole thing then. I've heard this exact sentence from him at least 20 times over the last decade. It's his catchphrase for failure. I ignored him and looked at my mother. I asked her how she could sit there and eat while her eldest son was losing everything he worked for. Her response was what really broke something inside me. She said, "You have a career, you have skills, you can always build back. But Stephen, if those men come for him, he has nothing. We did what any parents would do to save their child's life. We thought you were strong enough to handle this burden for the family." The sheer entitlement in her voice was staggering. She wasn't asking for my help. She was telling me that my life was less valuable because I was strong and successful. To them, my hard work wasn't a reason to respect me. It was a resource for them to tap into whenever Stephen messed up. My father eventually went to his study and brought back a thin manila envelope. As I flipped through the pages, I realized the interest rate was even higher than I initially thought. It was 18%, compounding weekly after the 30-day grace period. These weren't bankers, they were legalized sharks. But there was something else in the fine print that caught my eye. There was a secondary signature on the witness line that looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place it at that moment. I tucked the papers under my arm and turned to leave. Stephen yelled after me that I was acting like a jerk, and that I should be glad I could contribute to the family's safety. I didn't even turn around. Back at my house, I started digging into Stephen's social media and his recent business associates. I found out that the fraud he mentioned wasn't just him being a victim. He had been trying to set up some kind of unlicensed gambling ring for local college students, and he had lost the house's money to a professional player who realized Stephen was an amateur. The debt collectors weren't just random thugs. They were the people who had backed his original bankroll. My parents knew this. They knew he hadn't just lost money in crypto. They knew he had been doing something illegal and dangerous, and they still chose to put my house on the line to cover his tracks. I spent the next 3 days in a state of hyperfocus, working 18 hours a day on every freelance project I could find, trying to scrape together anything. I reached out to old clients, asked for advances, and even looked into selling my car. But no matter how I did the math, I was still $80,000 short. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, thinking it was the law firm or the lenders. The isolation was the worst part. I couldn't tell my friends because I was too ashamed of what my family had done. And I couldn't talk to my parents because every conversation ended in them guilt-tripping me about family loyalty. On the 10th day of the month, I received a package in the mail. It wasn't from the lawyers. It was an anonymous envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of my house taken from the street, with a red X drawn over the front door in marker. There was no note, just the picture. That's when it hit me that this wasn't just about money anymore. These people knew where I lived, and they were watching me. My parents hadn't just stolen my equity. They had brought a predator to my doorstep. I realized then that I couldn't just find the money. I had to find a way to fight back. But I was playing a game where the rules were written by the people who wanted to destroy me, and my own family was holding the pen. The middle of the second week felt like a slow-motion car crash that I was forced to watch from the driver's seat while my hands were tied to the steering wheel. I had stopped sleeping more than 3 hours a night because every time I closed my eyes, I saw that red X on my front door and heard my mother's voice telling me that I was strong enough to lose everything. I had spent the last 48 hours trying to liquidate every asset I possessed, listing my high-end rendering computers, my backup cameras, and even my vintage watch collection on every marketplace I could find. I was desperate to show the lenders some progress, hoping that a show of good faith might buy me more time or at least get them to stop sending people to photograph my porch. But when I told my parents that I was planning to use the $30,000 I could realistically raise to pay down the principal immediately, they didn't look relieved. They looked horrified. We met at a local diner because I couldn't stand to be in their house or have them in mine, and the conversation turned toxic within 5 minutes of the coffee hitting the table. My mother, Linda, grabbed my wrist across the table and told me that I couldn't give that money to the lenders yet because Stephen had another urgent situation that required immediate cash. She actually had the nerve to say that since I was already prepared to lose the house, the extra $30,000 wouldn't make a difference to me, but it would give Stephen a chance to start over in another state. I sat there looking at her, feeling a level of disgust that I didn't know I was capable of feeling toward my own mother. I told her that this money was my last-ditch effort to keep a roof over my head, to save the one thing I had worked for since I was 22 years old. That was when the specific hard period argument came out, weaponized like a knife. My father leaned in, his face red, and told me that I was being incredibly short-sighted and cruel to my own blood. He said, "You have to understand, your brother is going through a very difficult period right now. He's fragile, and his mental health is at an all-time low because of the pressure these people are putting on him. You're just talking about a house and a dream of owning a studio, but we are talking about Stephen's life." He told me that my dream of expanding my business was a luxury, while Stephen's survival was a necessity. They essentially told me that I should officially give up on everything I had planned for my career because Stephen's hard period trumped my entire existence. They wanted me to take the money I was scraping together and hand it directly to the person who had caused the problem in the first place, just so he could run away and leave me to deal with the debt collectors alone. The conflict escalated when I flatly refused and told them I was going to the police to report the unauthorized use of the power of attorney. My father's demeanor changed instantly from pleading to threatening. He reminded me that his name was on the deed and that if I went to the authorities, he would testify that I had given them verbal permission to use the house as collateral. He was willing to commit perjury to protect Stephen and keep the money flowing into his Fresh Start fund. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting a debt. I was fighting a coordinated effort by my own parents to strip mine my life to fuel my brother's delusions. The betrayal felt physical, like a cold blade between my ribs. I walked out of that diner while my mother was still calling me unfathomably selfish loud enough for the other patrons to hear. When I got home, I found that the locks on my back door had been tampered with. They hadn't been broken, but there were scratches around the keyhole that weren't there that morning. I didn't even feel safe in my own kitchen anymore. I spent the night sitting on the floor of my hallway with a baseball bat, watching the shadow of the front door. My phone was blowing up with texts from Steven, ranging from, "I'm sorry, man," to, "You're a deadbeat brother for letting me twist in the wind like this." The psychological warfare was constant. By the end of the third week, I was a shell of a person. I had lost 8 pounds. My skin was gray from lack of sunlight and nutrition, and I was starting to jump at every car that drove past the house. The tension reached a breaking point when I discovered who the witness on the loan document was. I took a high-resolution scan of the signature and sent it to a friend who works in a local law office. A few hours later, he called me back and told me the signature belonged to a man named Marcus Thorne. My heart dropped. Marcus was my father's lifelong best friend and a disgraced former notary who had lost his license years ago for fraudulent filings. This meant the loan document wasn't just a bad deal. It was potentially a criminal conspiracy involving my father's inner circle. I finally had a piece of information that they didn't know I had, but the weight of it was terrifying. If I used this, I wouldn't just be saving my house. I would be sending my father and his best friend to prison. As the final week approached, the lenders stopped sending pictures and started making phone calls. They didn't use names. They just told me that the grace period was a courtesy and that they were looking forward to seeing the sold sign on my lawn. I felt like the walls of my home were literally closing in on me. I had 7 days left. My parents had stopped calling me altogether, choosing instead to send me a formal family agreement via email that stated if I gave them the $30,000, they would try to help me negotiate with the lenders later. It was a blatant lie, a final attempt to rob me before the ship went down. I sat in my darkened living room, looking at the email, looking at the evidence of the fraud, and looking at the bat on the floor. I knew that whatever I did next would change the trajectory of my life forever, and there was no version of the future where I still had a family. By the 25th day, the world felt like it was made of glass that was vibrating just enough to shatter at any second. I had stopped going into my studio altogether and was doing the bare minimum of work from a laptop while sitting in my car at various parking lots. Too paranoid to stay in the house during the day and too exhausted to leave it at night. The weight of the secret I was carrying, the knowledge that Marcus Thorne's signature on the document was a blatant act of fraud, was making me physically ill. I had 2 options. I could take this evidence to the district attorney and watch my father get led away in handcuffs, or I could let the clock run out and lose the only thing I had ever truly owned. I spent hours sitting in a McDonald's parking lot, staring at the digital clock on my dashboard, watching the minutes tick away, feeling like a ghost in my own life. I decided to make one final, documented attempt to resolve this before I destroyed my family forever. I drove to my parents' house without calling ahead, and for the first time in my life, I recorded the entire interaction on my phone, which I tucked into my breast pocket. When I walked in, the house felt different. There were packed boxes in the hallway, and some of the smaller pieces of furniture were already gone. My mother was standing in the kitchen, wrapping plates in bubble wrap. I asked her what she was doing, and she didn't even look up. She just said that they were downsizing because the stress of the situation was too much for my father's heart and they needed to simplify their lives. It was then that I realized they were preparing to leave me behind. They were planning to vanish the moment the house was seized, likely moving to wherever Stephen was starting over. I asked her where Stephen was, and she finally looked at me with a coldness that made my skin crawl. She told me that Stephen had already left Austin for a secure location because the people he owed money to were getting impatient. I pulled out the copy of the loan document and pointed to Marcus Thorne's signature. I told her I knew it was forged or, at the very least, notarized by a man with a revoked license. I told her that this was enough to send Dad to prison for a long time. I expected her to cry, to beg, to finally admit they had gone too far. Instead, she just stopped what she was doing, leaned against the counter and sighed. "You think you're so smart, Alex," she said, using my full name with a tone of pure exhaustion. "You think you're the only one who knows how to read a contract. Your father didn't do this just for Stephen. He did it for us too." That was when the real twist hit me, and it was far worse than a simple case of favoritism. My mother admitted that my father had been dipping into his own retirement fund for years to cover his own gambling losses, a habit he had hidden from me and apparently passed down to Stephen. The business failures Stephen had weren't just bad luck. They were a family tradition of blowing through cash. The house wasn't just a way to save Stephen. It was a way for my father to get a massive lump sum of cash through a kickback arrangement with the lenders. They had struck a deal where the lenders would seize the house, sell it quickly, and give my father a 20% cut of the profit under the table, which they would use to move away and start a new life with Stephen in another state. They weren't just using my house as collateral. They were selling it out from under me to fund their own escape from the mess they had created. I stood there in the kitchen, listening to my mother explain how logical it was. She said that since the house had appreciated so much in value, there was enough money for everyone to get a little something. Except for me, of course, because I was young enough to start over. They had calculated my destruction as a line item in their family budget. The level of betrayal was so absolute that I didn't even feel angry anymore. I just felt a profound sense of emptiness. I was standing in the kitchen of the people who raised me, and they were telling me that my life's work was nothing more than a convenient ATM for their failures. My father walked in during the middle of this, saw the look on my face, and didn't even try to lie. He just asked me if I was going to be a man about it or if I was going to ruin everything for everyone. The moral dilemma was now a razor-sharp edge. If I went to the police, I would stop the sale, but I would expose the kickback scheme, the forgery, and the gambling debts. My father would go to prison, my mother would be an accomplice, and my brother would likely be hunted down by the people he actually owed money to. If I did nothing, I would be homeless in 5 days, but my parents would get their fresh start. I looked at my father, a man I had spent 30 years trying to impress, and I realized he was just a small, desperate thief. I walked out of the house without saying a word, the recording still running in my pocket. That night, I received a final text from an unknown number. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a photo of the legal notice of sale that had just been posted on the county website. The auction was set for Friday. I had 72 hours. I sat on my porch watching the streetlights, holding my phone with the recording and the scan of Marcus Thorne's signature. My thumb hovered over the send button to my lawyer and the local police department's tip line. If I pressed it, I would save my house, but I would effectively delete my entire family from my life. If I didn't, I would be the one deleted. The silence in the neighborhood was deafening, and for the first time, I understood that there is no such thing as a right choice when everyone you love is trying to kill you. 48 hours before the auction, I stopped being a son. I spent the entire morning in a small, windowless room at the local police precinct, sitting across from a detective named Miller, who looked like he had seen every variation of human greed the city of Austin had to offer. I played the recording of my mother explaining the kickback scheme, and I handed over the high-resolution scans of Marcus Thorne's fraudulent signature. The room was quiet except for the sound of my mother's voice coming through the phone speakers, sounding so casual about destroying my life that even the detective took a long, slow breath when the recording ended. He told me that since Marcus Thorne was already on their radar for similar notary fraud cases, this was the missing piece they needed to open a much larger investigation into the private lending firm, Apex Holdings. I didn't feel a sense of victory. I just felt a cold, hollow numbness spreading from my chest to my fingertips. On the 29th day, the storm finally broke. I was sitting on my porch, watching the sun come up, when 3 black SUVs pulled into my parents' driveway just 2 blocks away. I didn't go over there, but I could see the flashing lights through the gaps in the trees. My lawyer had filed an emergency injunction the night before, freezing the sale of my house and naming the loan as a fraudulent instrument. By noon, my phone was a graveyard of missed calls and frantic text messages. My mother sent a message saying, "You've killed your father. I hope you're happy," followed by a string of insults that I didn't even bother to read to the end. My father, Robert, was taken in for questioning along with Marcus Thorne. The kickback they were expecting had vanished, and in its place was a mounting pile of legal fees and the very real possibility of prison time for bank fraud and conspiracy. The most chilling part happened later that evening. I was sitting in my living room, the lights off, when I heard a car pull up. It was Stephen. He didn't come to the door. He just stood in the middle of my lawn and screamed at the top of his lungs. He called me a traitor and a snitch, shouting that I had ruined the only chance the family had to get out of debt. He didn't mention the fact that the debt was his. He didn't mention that the house was mine. To him and to my parents, I was just a barrier to their survival. He eventually got back in his car and sped off, and that was the last time I saw him. My father's lawyer later called to tell me that Robert was being released on bail, but that the state was moving forward with charges. The lending company, realizing their leverage was gone due to the forged documents, backed off immediately to avoid further scrutiny into their own business practices. My house was safe, but the victory felt like ashes in my mouth. As the month came to a close, the silence in my life became absolute. My parents stopped calling. They didn't show up at my door. I heard through a distant cousin that they were forced to sell their own house to cover the legal defense fund and the restitution for the people Stephen actually owed money to. They moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the other side of the state, and from what I understand, they still blame me for betraying the family. They never once apologized. They never acknowledged that they had tried to steal my future. In their narrative, they are the victims of a heartless son who prioritized bricks and mortar over his own flesh and blood. I realized that the difficult period they kept talking about wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment. It was their entire character. Now I sit in my house, the house I fought so hard to keep, and it feels different. The walls are the same color, the floorboards still creak in the same spots, but the soul of the place is gone. Every time I walk into the kitchen, I remember my mother wrapping her plates, ready to leave me behind without a second thought. I won the legal battle, but I lost the illusion of a family, and I'm starting to think the illusion was the only thing holding me together. I look at the empty guest room where I used to think my parents would stay if they ever got too old to live alone, and I realize that room will remain empty for the rest of my life. I have my equity, I have my credit score, and I have my roof, but the cost of that roof was the realization that the people who gave me life were the ones most willing to take it away. It's been 30 days since this all started. I changed the locks today, not because I'm afraid of the lenders, but because I'm afraid of the ghosts of the people I used to love. I keep the recording of my mother's voice on my laptop, not because I want to listen to it, but as a reminder of what family loyalty actually looks like when there's a dollar sign attached to it. People always say that blood is thicker than water, but they forget that you can also drown in it. I don't know if I'll stay in this house much longer. It's hard to call a place a home when every corner reminds you of a lie. I'm 34 years old. I have 100% ownership of a beautiful piece of real estate, and I have never felt more homeless in my entire life.